and has received numerous prestigious fellowships and grants, including from the NEA, the Rockefeller, Guggenheim, and Mellon Foundations. In 2018, Hughes co-curated and gave a presentation in a day-long symposium at MoMA entitled Performing Difference, Double X-Rated, Legacies of Feminist and Queer Performance. This evening, she is sharing a new piece, Indelible, Christine Blasey Ford as performance artist. Adapting to the webinar format, she is billing this as a lecture performance. She expects it to last about an hour, after which I'll reappear to moderate a Q&A. We invite you to submit your comments and questions via that mechanism. The session is being recorded. Thank you, and please welcome Holly Hughes.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Kim, for that great introduction and for inviting me to come to Iowa and for this opportunity. And I really want to also thank Nick Arp. Kim and Nick spent a couple of hours this week wrestling with how to do this slideshow in the Zoom setting. And I also, a couple of other thanks. Behind me is a detail from an image by my friend and colleague Heidi Kamau from a new body of work that engages with imagery that comes out of the Christine Blasey Ford testimony before the Senate Judiciary Committee. And her show is up right now in New York City. I know some people might be zooming in from there at Ceres Gallery. So go and check it out. Thank you. Thanks for coming tonight. I want to talk to you tonight about Christine Blasey Ford, and I want to, I'd also like to talk about all the other people who've come forward before and since with their own accounts of surviving sexual violence. But of course, I can't, but I want to take a moment and summon them into the space that we're sharing together. I'm sure you know Christine Blasey Ford as a woman who testified under oath in the Senate Judiciary Committee that Brett Kavanaugh and a buddy had attempted to rape her when she was 15. And you may know that she holds a PhD from USC. She's a professor at Palo Alto University and a research psychology at Stanford University School of Medicine. She's not a clinician. She's not going to help you figure out what to deal with your mother. She uses statistics to talk about the long-range impact of trauma, the 9/11 attacks, child abuse, queer people forced to live their lives in the closet across populations and time. But she has not been able to return to that job since her testimony. She and her husband have not been able to go back to the house that they had redesigned to include more exterior doors because since the alleged attack, she has not been able to live in a house with a normal amount of exterior exits. I like to say she's something else. She's a performance artist. Look, it's not really that hard to be a performance artist. Anyone can be a performance artist. Actually, the hallmark of the form is a lack of rules, a lack of codification. And some artists claim this title because they want to escape the confines of the art market. They don't want to make fancy things for fancy people or to hang in a museum. They aren't interested in the endless debate about what is and what isn't good art. Performance art is often less about beauty than it is about ideas, confrontational ideas, according to the performance artist and gallerist, Martha Wilson. And it takes place in real time. And the body is its irreducible medium. Performance artists are not really interested in the willful suspension of disbelief, which is so central to theater and the movies. In other words, they're not actors. There's no artifice. They want to remind you this is happening now in real time. And, sometimes performance art might seem just like a highbrow stunt, like, French aerialist Philippe Petit, who walked a tightrope between the two twin towers shortly after they opened. And then there's the case of Chris Burden, who did a lot of pieces, such as hiring a friend to shoot him, which he filmed, and another piece in which he's bolted to the hood of a VW Beetle. And it kind of looks like this sort of like bohemian American Jesus. Sometimes performance artists take a very simple action and they do it in such a way that we understand that the action is not so simple after all. So take the case of African-American artist Bill Popel, or as he's often known, Pope Al, famous for his crawls, which consist of exactly what they sound like. He crawls on his hands and knees, often dressed either in a business suit or a very baggy Superman costume, pushing a little tiny flower pot ahead of him. And he has crawled the entire length of Michigan. That would be impressive. Manhattan, from the southern tip through Wall Street, all the way up to the northern tip, 22 miles. There's another artist, Taiwanese artist, Taixing Shi, punched a time clock every hour, on the hour, 24/7 for a year. He was an immigrant. He was doing low-wage work that's often called low-skilled, but requires often incredible physical commitment. And he was also wanting to say, I think, this is my job. Being an artist is a job. It's work. She and another artist, Linda Montano, tied themselves together with an 8-foot length of rope for a year. And they made an agreement they're not going to touch. They weren't supported by grants. They didn't have a job like I have as a professor, where maybe they could have gotten some kind of a leave. So they had to find work that they could do together. They had to negotiate everything from when they were going to sleep to when they were going to go to the bathroom. And then sometimes the performance seems like it's not an action, it's an inaction. Sometimes it just seems extremely simple, like sitting for a long time in a chair, which is, of course, not so simple as anyone who's tried and failed in meditation will know. Marina Abramovich, in the red dress in this slide, is maybe the most famous of all performance artists. And her work is often about endurance, about duration. She often courts danger, engages in what looks like self-harm. But the hardest thing she's done, according to her, are the 2 pieces that she made that involved sitting, just sitting for a long period of time, looking at another person. You know, in popular culture, performance art is also a stand-in for a joke, a shorthand for kind of pretension and absurdity, but we're not without our sense of humor. Here's a joke. How many performance artists does it take to screw in a light bulb? I don't know. I left after the first 6 hours. In her TED Talk, Abramovich describes her work as energy dialogue. She doesn't just make something and share it with the audience. Her work isn't just taking something and putting it on the audience. She says the performance and the audience make the piece together. In theater, the knife is not a knife, she said, and the blood is just ketchup. Abramovich is on my mind when I watch Ford's testimony. I'm watching how physically difficult it is for her to just be in that chair. I'm watching her struggle as she tries not to cry. We see her ask, with apology, for a glass of water, for some caffeine, for a chance to go to the bathroom. So here's another definition between theater and performance, according to Abramovich. There is no rehearsal for performance because many times you can't live through a performance twice. Look at me when I'm talking to you. Minutes after then Senator Jeff Flake announced that he was going to vote to confirm Brett Kavanaugh, even though he also said that Christine Blasey Ford's testimony had raised doubts. 2 young Latinas trapped him in an elevator reserved only for senators. This is what Maria Gallagher, 23, a recent college grad, said. Look at me when I'm talking to you. You're telling me that my assault doesn't matter, that what happened to me doesn't matter. and that you are going to let people do these things with power. That's what you're telling me when you vote for him. Don't look away from me. Look at me. Look at me and tell me that it doesn't matter what happened to me. Flake was the second person she told about the assault. The first was her therapist, who didn't believe her. The TV cameras were rolling, as were several smartphones. You're telling all women that they don't matter, that they should just stay quiet, because if they tell what happened to them, you're going to ignore them. You're just going to help that man get to power anyways. That's what you're telling all of these women. That's what you're telling me right now. Flake finally meets the women's eyes and says, "Thank you." And Anna Maria Archila says, "Thank you is not an answer. I'm sorry is not an answer." The video goes viral. Gallagher pens an op-ed in the Times. Flake initiates an investigation. But here's the thing. Archila and Gallagher are not lone heroes. They're not alone. Here's some of the scene inside the Senate the day before. Here's some context. Several hundred protesters had come from across the country flooding DC in the lead up to the hearing. They staged protests outside the Capitol and outside the Supreme Court, mostly young, but not all, mostly female. They were attempting to, quote unquote, bird dog the senators. On the day of the hearing, over 300 people were arrested because they understood that what was unfolding was not just a rerun of an old movie that always ends the same way. It's not only about Christine Blasey Ford and Brett Kavanaugh, although it is also about them, and they don't want Brett Kavanaugh on the Supreme Court. It's about too many women, too many non-binary women, people, and some men finding echoes of their story in her testimony. Look at me when I'm talking to you. Look at me and tell me that it doesn't matter what happened to me. That's what you're telling me right now.
Senator Chuck Grassley, let's listen in.
On the nomination of
Mr.
Judge
Chairman.
Brett Kavanaugh
Mr. Chairman.
to serve as Associate Justice.
Mr. Chairman,
on the
I'd like to be
Supreme Court
recognized
of the
for a
United
question
States.
before we proceed.
Regular order, Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to be recognized to ask a question before we proceed. The committee received just last night, less than 15 hours ago,
Mr. Chairman, regular order.
42,000 pages of documents that we have not had an opportunity to review or read or analyze.
You're out of order. I'll proceed.
We cannot possibly move forward, Mr. Chairman,
I
with this
extend a
hearing.
very warm
We have
welcome
not
to
been
Judge
given an
Kavanaugh,
opportunity to have a meaningful
his wife,
hearing on
Ashley.
this nominee.
their two daughters.
Mr. Chairman,
Their
I
extended
agree with my
family and
colleague,
friends.
Senator Harris. Mr. Chairman,
Judge
we
Kavanaugh's
received
many law
42,000
clerks
documents that we haven't
and
been able
everyone else
to
joining us
review last
today.
night, and we believe this hearing
I
should be
know this is an
postponed.
exciting day for all of you here, and you're rightly proud
Mr. Chairman,
of
if
Judge.
we cannot be recognized, I move to adjourn.
The American people.
Chairman, I move
get
to adjourn.
hear directly from Judge Kavanaugh later this afternoon.
Mr. Chairman, I move to adjourn. Mr. Chairman, we have been denied real access to the documents we need to advise.
Chairman,
and
regular
consent,
order is called for.
which turns this hearing into a charade and a mockery of our norms.
Well-
And Mr. Chairman, I therefore move to adjourn this hearing.
Okay.
This is a mockery and a travesty of justice. This is a travesty of justice. We will not go back. Cancel Brett Kavanaugh. Adjourn the hearing.
Chuck? Command order. Chuck. The motion to adjourn, you have to have a vote.
We're not in executive session.
One of Marina Abramovich's most famous pieces could be called Look at Me, or Look at Me when I'm not talking to you. But instead it's called The Artist is Present. It was the centerpiece of her 2010 retrospective at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. And she sat for 8 hours a day facing whoever it was that sat across from her. She didn't take a break. She didn't eat. She didn't drink. She didn't move. After a few weeks, it became too difficult for her to hold that position. So she would just lower her head when between settings and raise it when someone took the seat across from her. There was no reservations system. People waited in line, sometimes for hours, and you could sit with her as long as you wanted. And other than the time her former collaborator and partner, Ule, came to sit with her, she didn't touch anyone. For an artist whose entire body of work is about endurance and courting danger, Abramovich has said that this piece and her other piece that involves sitting was the hardest. Between 1981 and 87, Abramovich and her partner Ule performed a piece called Night Sea Crossing, where they sat at either ends of a long table looking at each other without moving for hours, day after day. But it was then that their long partnership began to unravel because Ule wasn't up to it. In other pieces, they had screamed at each other back and forth for a set period of time. They braided their hair together. They had run at each other, slamming into each other naked in front of an audience for over an hour. But sitting still, looking at each other, was too much for him. He started to bail, and she stayed, looking in the empty place where he'd been. Here's a couple of images of their work. The last slide is Night Sea Crossing. Well, can you stop? Thank you. Stop. Can we go back a little bit to the image that has an image of, I'm sorry, Marina Abramovich, the artist is present. It's not an exact science doing this on Zoom. So yes, through all of this, look at those wonderful protesters. That's, yes, there, stop. Great, thank you. So I want to show you now some portraits of the people who sat with her, portraits of people who I understand to be men. Okay, Nick, we're ready. Great. And now here's some portraits of what I read as, of who I read as women who sat with Abramovich. And here's two images of people whose gender identity is not legible to me. And here's a few images of Marina Abramovich looking back. You know, I wasn't really that keen about watching the Christine Blasey Ford testimony. I think that was right, those slides. Yes, thank you. Thanks. Can you go back to me? Thank you. I remember telling Esther that if she'd asked me, if Dr. Ford had asked me, I said, like, don't do it. It's not worth it. I've been calling myself a feminist for almost 50 years for some of the same reasons that many other women of my generation did. I mean, I didn't want to be my mother. And also, I had been raped twice before I was 20. So I've lost track of all the times that we seem to be on the cusp of a cultural reckoning on sexual violence in its many variations. I've lost track of all the time the media has declared we are having a cultural reckoning about sexual assault, about violence against women. And it's completely different than all the other times we've had it before. We know so much better, so much more. By reckoning, I don't mean those exceedingly rare moments when a man is held to account. By reckoning, I mean the moment when we might stop framing the conversation in terms of just individuals and talk about systems. By reckoning, I mean that we recognize when we talk about dismantling sexism, we're not just talking about having some better policies, although sure, let's say like have some better policies, have some better laws. I mean, reckoning is understanding that what we mean by sexism, that it is a system in which we are all implicated, like capitalism, like racism, and like those systems, it is held in place by violence and the threat of violence. I'm going to say the obvious thing. Women are afraid of men. I'm going to say that again. All women are afraid of men, even the women who blame victims. In the victim blaming is an admission. Men are dangerous. They're out of control. They're unpredictable. And it's on you to keep yourself safe. Queer, non-binary people are afraid of men, and many men are afraid of men. And don't come at me with your, not all men song and dance. What if being a nice guy is sometimes a tactic? Bill Cosby, America's Dad, who would suspect him? Dr. Larry Nassar seemed like the greatest guy, a dad, an Olympic doctor, a pillar of his small town, which made it so much easier for him to shove his ungloved fingers inside the vaginas of young women while their parents were right there in the room with them and pass it off as a treatment for a broken ankle. I don't find it hard to believe that Brett Kavanaugh is a great dad. A student tells me about a man that comes up to her at a supermarket and says, "Let me carry your groceries to the car." And she understands. It's about more. He wants to have a conversation, maybe more, and she isn't into it. So she says, "No, thank you." And he persists. And he said, "I think you really need a hand. This is too much for you." And then she understands that he's reminding her he's stronger than she is. He's asking nicely now, but he might not the next time. And she's afraid of him. And she's also afraid she might hurt his feelings. Another time, she's in a grocery store. An old man grabs her by her hair. He wraps it around her head. He pulls her towards her and holds her in place by her hair. No one does anything. She's afraid to say anything. He's like, "Give it to me, and I'll let you go." What if we understand that violence is central to patriarchy? What if we ask more of men? As a queer theater artist, I cannot count the many feminist performance pieces that I've sat through, where the story, after the story of the rape, the betrayal, the harassment, a diagnosis of sexism, it's followed by a declaration of how much the woman, the performer, loves men. I've seen a lot of different ways you can theatricalize not all men, but I have never seen a male performer in any kind of show, whether it's a play or a performance piece, say he loved women, at least, but not in a way that I would believe. So to watch her testimony as a feminist, as a survivor, is to become invested in a justice system that doesn't that not only fails to deliver any form of justice on an individual level and never addresses the structural problems and punishes the accuser. I'm not so into it. I'm really not so into it. I can't not watch Christine Blasey Ford. It's like she's saying to me, look at me. I feel like I've become Marina Abramovich, perched in a chair, unwilling to move, to take my eyes off of her for hours at end. So in 1979, as Kim said, I moved to New York City from Michigan to go to the New York Feminist Art Institute. And the night before I left, my father said, so what is feminism? And that's what I was going to find out after I got there. And I was thinking, all I know is it's not here in this room right now. And I know it's not something I can do on my own. You can't be a feminist on your own. You're just the neighborhood witch. I mean, but who needed definitions anyways? It was 1979. We had orange shag, we had disco, we had Patti Smith. Quiche was a health food. So I went to the New York Feminist Art Institute, where instead of classes where we would learn art techniques, we did consciousness raising. You sit in a circle, the topic's introduced, and everyone gets to tell their story. Mothers, fathers, your body, money, sex, without interruption. No one doubts you. No one laughs at you. No one tells you you're crazy. And then the work starts. The work of putting all those individual stories in a larger context. Because it's not just your story. Your story together with these other stories paints a picture. And the question is asked, what are we going to do about it? It's in this room and in this conversation and other rooms like it, and also reading writers like Adrienne Rich and Audre Lorde, that my life starts to make a kind of sense. I mean, it's not hard to say I was raped when I was 19 and a man held a gun to my head. I mean, it's not hard to say that, but it's only through being in feminist spaces and with other feminists that I start to make sense of other parts of the story, like why the police made me look at one photograph of a Black man after another when I said, well, I'm sure he was white. And they're like, are you sure? Are you sure he's white? And all of a sudden, I'm not sure. I want it to be someone. I want it to not just be anyone. It's in these rooms I began to understand other things that happened to me, that what happened to me when I was 15 was also rape. Was it date rape? We weren't really dating. I wanted to go on a date, but we were just like hanging out in my finished basement of my house. And, I wanted something to happen, but it hadn't. And I thought maybe it would start with like, I don't know, a touch, a kiss, you give me a look. But that's not how it started. It started with him dropping his pants. It started with him grabbing me and throwing me on the couch. I don't remember saying no. I don't remember saying anything. I remember hating it and thinking, what if this is sex? What if this is sex and it's awful? Or this is sex and everybody else likes it and I hate it and I'm awful. Afterwards, he leaves. I tell my parents, my father keeps watching TV, and my mother says, well, you're lucky. You haven't had a boyfriend. You're lucky a boy likes you. You're not very pretty. And my mother will invite this guy to come over the house when she's not going to be there. She will tell him, you're always welcome at our house. And when I leave home, when I move to another city, she'll tell him where I live. And he'll show up at my door. So it's not just about, this is bad. And, my mother's not great. But telling this within a feminist space becomes more than a recitation of something that happened to me and a condemnation of my mother. I began to understand how it fits in a larger system, a system that hurts women, but is one in which some women are also complicit. So when I prepare to teach the history of performance art, I always ask if I can get the job done without talking about my two least favorite, but perhaps some of the most famous work made by women. And I don't really think I can. And those works are Yoko Ono's Cut Piece, first performed in 1964, and then subsequently performed in many locations around the world by Ono and also by other artists she's given permission to, and Marina Abramovich's Rhythm 2. Let's just take a quick look at those. These slides are of Rhythm 0 by Marina Abramovich. And these slides are from various performances of Cut Piece by Yoko Ono. Oops, can you go back? Great, thank you. Maybe get ready. Yes, great, thank you. So two different artists I respect, interesting artists who've made important work, but I have trouble with these two pieces. In both of the pieces, a woman artist presents herself to a room full of strangers, provides them with a bunch of sharp objects, tells them she's going to be completely passive, and invites them to do with her what they will. How do you think this is going to go? I mean, really, how do you think this is going to go? Don't overthink it. I think you know. When I talk about these pieces, I think my students are always moved by learning about the pieces, and they tend to see them as a searing critique of the male gaze, which they have come to understand now as not just the tendency of men to locate their faces somewhere around their breasts, but also as a kind of predatory behavior that moves women through the world with the implied threat of violence. Just as a border collie moves sheep around the field and gets them into a pen with a hard stare. The sheep don't know the border collie's not going to eat them, and they move. So in this class, I say, yes, well, where is the critique? Is this perhaps just a restatement of the problem? And I keep thinking, why are we seeing this again and again? Don't we already know this? In Cut Piece, Yoko Ono wore her best suit of clothes. She provided scissors, and the audience was invited to cut pieces off to take with them. And some of them do it gently, and some of them are rougher. And eventually she is stripped bare and bleeding. In Rhythm 0, Abramovich set up a table with 72 objects and told the audience they could use them however they wanted on her, and she wouldn't resist. And it would go on for 6 hours. It began quietly. Somebody gives her a rose, somebody flicks her with a little feather. In the 3rd hour, all the clothes are cut off of her with razor blades. And then some people start using the razor blades to cut into other parts of her body. Someone slashes her throat and drinks her blood. They carry her to the table. They spread her legs. They ram a knife between her legs. And a man puts a loaded gun in her hand and holds it to her head. At 6 hours, she ends the piece, bloody, crying. Ono and Abramovich's commitment to total passivity renders them art martyrs, in my mind. They're celebrated for that, for putting up with that. They're endurance artists. But I think the work normalizes male violence, aestheticizes it, and celebrates women's lack of resistance to it. Lots of male artists make work that explores pain in their work, but the pain's controlled. It's usually self-inflicted. Say, Chris Burden, I mentioned him before, who had someone shoot him in the arm. He hired a friend who was good with guns and made sure that the guy was going to hit him in the arm and not in the head. And there was no audience. It was filmed. Is Christine Blasey Ford testimony another gesture like Cut Piece or Rhythm 0? I think about Ishina Robinson, a writer for The Root, who is covering the Derek Chauvin murder case. And she hasn't watched the infamous videotape of Mr. Floyd being murdered. She has no intention to doing it. But it's traumatizing to just listen to the witnesses. She applauds their courage. She applauds their bravery. And obviously, it's traumatizing to them to re-experience it, to tell it, to be questioned. She recognizes that this is a part of an effort to get justice. It's important, but it too often ends there with the traumatic testimony, with the call to invest in a justice system that doesn't deliver. So is her testimony, Christine Blasey Ford's, just another piece where a woman makes herself extremely vulnerable to a room full of strangers who have access to sharp objects? Is this another moment where the problem is merely restated? A part of me says yes. I mean, how many stories, really, more stories do we need to hear? How many more Me Too hashtags? Really? I can't lay the blame at the feet of the survivors. The performance is not just something the performer makes and gives to an audience. Abramovich says, the performer and the audience make the piece together. Here's a performance piece that I like a lot more. An image of Sally's rape by Robbie McCauley, made in collaboration with Jeannie Hutchins. In the piece, Robbie, the African-American woman standing, and Jeannie Hutchins, a white woman in the foreground, share experiences of sexual assault. It's a conversation between, whoops, can we go back? I don't know what happened. All right, that's fine. It's a conversation between friends, mostly. But rape doesn't hold the same meaning for white women, the same history as it does for Black women. There's a history of the rape of enslaved women that's referenced in the title, Sally Hemings, and the way that Black men have been terrorized under the guise of protecting white women. So the conversation keeps moving back and forth between the personal stories and that fundamental feminist gesture towards putting the personal stories in a larger political context and asking us, what are you going to do about it? It's interrupted the conversation at different times by opening up to the audience, led by Robbie. She asks us questions. It's not rhetorical. It's not a stunt. It's not something that was developed in a theater workshop. They're real questions. She's interested in what you have to say. And near the end of the piece, she takes her clothes off. She gets up on an actor's block, and she embodies Sally Hemings as Jeannie invites us to bid her in, to bid on her. And Robbie talks to us inside this space of inside this space of being a naked African-American woman whose body was devalued and sold. We're not exonerated in this process, but we're making meaning together. We are taking the historical trauma into account as we are invited to consider what it means as we move together towards justice. Rachel Denhollander is often described as the woman who finally brought down Larry Nassar after decades of abuse, Dr. Larry Nassar. And I kind of hate that description because, it erases the hundreds of women and girls who were abused by them. And some of those women and girls were abused by him dozens, even hundreds of times. Some of them did not have words for what was happening to them. Some of them learned to not trust what their bodies told them, and some of them came forward but weren't taken seriously. Kyle Stevens was not a gymnast. She wasn't an athlete. The Stevens family were friends with the Nassar family, and they spent every Sunday evening together. So starting at age 6, Kyle would be in the basement, supposedly watching big screen TV with Uncle Larry, and he would be abusing her. She didn't know what it was until she was 12. And she told her parents, when Uncle Larry gives me a massage, he likes to use his penis. Her parents didn't believe her. They made her apologize to Larry Nassar. They made her go into therapy to deal with her compulsive lying. When she was 18, she finally confronted her father and said, I never lied about it. This really happened. And her father killed himself. Rachel Denhollander is an unlikely feminist hero. One of the 350 plus women who eventually signed on to the case. She was the only one for whom the stars aligned, the one who was believed, protected, and trained herself to eventually take him down. She was a 15-year-old gymnast in Kalamazoo, Michigan, when she saw Nassar for an injury. When he shoved his ungloved fingers into her vagina, rubbed his heart on against her, she knew it was wrong. She told her mother, who believed her, but said, no one else will. But we are going to get him. We are going to get him. She got a therapist for Rachel. She encouraged Rachel to document everything that had happened to her. And she said, one day, we will use this to bring him down. 204 women gave victim impact statements in front of Larry Nassar. They got to tell their story without interruption. It took 9 days. If you want to hear more about it and learn more about it, I recommend the podcast series Believed by Michigan Public Media. And here is Larry Nassar, who could never look them in the eyes. Mostly Christine Blasey Ford has disappeared from public eye since her testimony, but she made one public appearance, giving an award to Rachel Denhollander. Whether her testimony was just another painful moment in the long struggle against sexual violence, an act that clearly re-traumatized her, upended her life, and also re-traumatized those of us who listened, knowing that probably nothing was going to happen, cathartic, but also perhaps futile. It's not a question that she has to answer whether this was a rhetorical gesture. It's not a question that anyone who comes forward should have to answer. They have done their part. What are we going to do when we hear their stories and all of the stories that we have heard? You can't do feminism on your own. The performance is not a thing that is made by the performer and is dumped on the head of the audience. Together, the performer and the audience make the piece of what is actually happening in real time to real bodies in front of us. And here is Dr. Christine Blasey Ford presenting an award to Rachel Denhollander. It's a celebration, but I think it's also a question.
Good evening. I am honored to speak with you from afar about a woman I admire so much. A woman who suffered abuse as a vulnerable teenage athlete, who found the courage to talk publicly to stop the abuse of others. Her courage inspired other survivors to end their silence, and we all know the result. Rachel Denhollander, I am in awe of you, and I will always be inspired by you. In stepping forward, you took a huge risk, and you galvanized future generations to come forward, even when the odds are seemingly stacked against them. The lasting lesson is that we all have the power to create real change, and we cannot allow ourselves to be defined by the acts of others. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome this year's Sports Illustrated Inspiration of the Year, Rachel Den Hollander.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Holly. You've certainly pushed us as you always do. And you've given us this lens of performance art to think through these testimonies and this notion of the performer and the audience making the performance together, and all of our roles, our complicity, our participation in that system. So I think we already have some questions coming into the Q&A, and I invite others to please continue, and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can. So let me just read this one, Holly. Jennifer Metzger says, "Hi, Holly. So moving. Do you think that in this day, performance artists need to be aware of what's happening in real time to real bodies and shift their practice to honor this?"
Thank you, Jennifer. Jennifer is a colleague at Michigan, and she's a wonderful writer. I'm so honored that she came here. Well, you know, all this hubbub about performance art, I teach performance art, but I don't consider myself a performance artist. I think of myself more as a thespian, which I think of as a mudroom that connects quote unquote real theater with performance art. I don't make that kind of work that so many artists I listed tonight. I think that performance art strength often is dealing with real time and real bodies and without artifice. So pieces like Popel, a Black man crawling around a city in a suit, or the Superman costume, pushing a little flower pot ahead of him, which I kind of love that detail. So he never really arrives at the flower pot, but it's like he's always crawling towards something beautiful. I think there's one thing that's different about performance art. There's the audience that's there, you know, in the streets while it's happening. And then there's the secondary audience through the documentation. And you're also watching the response of the primary audience, who are people in real time, how are they responding to it? So I think that I think there's lots of opportunities for performance art to make interventions in this complicated moment.
And then just to follow on that, here's a question from Betsy Sheevy, who asks, isn't there a difference between Blasey Ford and Abramovich, a difference of intention? Abramovich is conscious of an intention of performance. Blasey Ford is inside another ritual of Congress, court, the trial, etc. A big difference, no?
Yeah, I think obviously they're different, but I think that I by calling her a performance artist, I wanted to lean on that knowledge that we might have of that art form, engaging with physical risk. And again, often taking something that might seem simple, and revealing in the way that it's presented the difficulty in it. So I think that probably Christine Blasey Ford was very aware of this as a performance. performance in which she was trying very hard not to act, but to stay in a controlled and professional sort of frame. And I think we see the physical risk and we see the toll in it. And so I think they're different, but I think they live in relationship to each other. And maybe you don't agree.
We have an anonymous attendee who asks, do you know if anyone moved to protect Marina during the time she was being assaulted? If so, what happened to them? Christine's performance continues.
Well, I know that, well, no one, I mean, people might have left. People might have chosen not to participate in it. When someone took the loaded gun and put it in her hand and held it at her head, they didn't take the step of like pulling the trigger. But I have not read any accounts, and I've read quite a few accounts of this, of someone trying to stop somebody from doing something. So I don't think so. Like I said, it started off kind of slow. This piece makes me crazy. Why do this? Don't you know this is going to happen? How can you not know this? Why do we see this? And it makes me crazy because Abramovich, who is somebody that I admire, has also really worked very hard to disassociate herself from feminism. And without a feminist analysis, I don't know what I'm looking at here. It seems, then I sort of feel like I'm someone from my father's Kiwanis Club back in the 1960s. And like, what kind of a stunt is this? What'd you think was going to happen? This is craziness.
And that takes us right into this question by Leslie Schwalm, who's the current chair of GWIS, who you met yesterday. Leslie says, one of the most important and powerful things I heard tonight, you can't do feminism alone. This speaks to the importance of GWIS. In our classrooms, we make it collective experience and effort. Do you teach this performance? How do your students respond?
Do I teach I guess she means the Marina Abramovich piece?
I'm sure that, and perhaps the Blasey Ford as performance.
I haven't taught this to my, I think it's become very difficult. I think in classroom space, I would have to think about how I would teach this. It's become, difficult. This is an upsetting topic to engage with, and I understand that and appreciate that. And again, I don't want to play the card of survivor to the hilt, but I do, and sort of silence someone else by my survivorship is greater than yours, or my experience is the only experience. But I fully understand that. But I think oddly in this moment, it's become difficult to have conversations about this in spaces because it's so upsetting. And we sort of sometimes veer into these moments of thinking we can't be upset. If we're upset in the classroom, we're doing something wrong. And I think that classrooms should be a place where, a lot of what is happening in the world, especially now, is very upsetting and complicated. And that the goal might be to have our feelings and be able to think and talk through it at the same time. But yes, I think if I had a point to this, which I'm not sure that I did in what I was doing tonight, was in some ways my annoyance at the way that anti-sexual assault activism seems to like have just settled on one part of the equation, which is telling survivors to come forward. And, you know, we've heard from enough people. We've heard from enough women with the course of second wave feminism to get like the gist of what's going on. Are we going to do anything about it? That's what I want to know. I don't want to hear more people. I mean, fine, tell me. But I the fetishization of just the individual story and feeling like that does a thing. The thing that must be done is something that we have to do. And it has to be about something bigger than just bringing down an individual bad guy. Not that I'm, you know, opposed to bringing down an individual bad guy. And, you know, also, you know, sidebar, we need to talk about like what justice looks like that doesn't fit into a carceral mode and all of that.
And we have here from Gail Griffin, who writes, "Hi, Holly, Gail Griffin here. I'm ravished and ravaged by her talk and will be thinking about it for a long time. I'm wondering with regard to Cut Piece and Marina A's piece, whether there is any redeeming virtue in the notion that they force observers to see and enact their own abusive, predatory, violent impulses."
So I just want to like, hello to Gail Griffin, who's a friend of mine. And I want to say like Gail Griffin is an amazing feminist writer. She's a retired professor from Kalamazoo College. Her memoir, Grief's Country, was one of the best books I read last year. And she has a couple of collections of essays. Season of the Witch is one of them, and I can't remember the other one. She deserves to be more widely read. She's just a brilliant intersectional feminist thinker and writer. So what's the question? Is there something redeeming? But I'm not sure. I'm not sure what goes on in the participants in these pieces. When I hear about somebody like, you know, taking a razor blade and slashing somebody's neck and drinking the blood, I'm not thinking there's a lot of self-reflection going on in that moment, but maybe that's me. You know, I'm seeing kind of like sort of a mob in that. I think obviously Cut Piece is a little bit different. You know, there are the scissors, there's not a gun, there's the scissors. There's a little more direction about what to do. And I think like a lot of performance art, the meaning is made by the context the artist situates it in and how other people frame it, which is, it's why it's never accomplishes its goal to be accessible. That's what performance artists think. Like, I'm going to escape, you know, the confines of the gallery system and the academy and take my work directly to the people. And people are like, man, this is, I don't know why you're doing this shit. This is freaking me out. And I didn't, you know, have a lot of, you know, 20th century art history. So I don't know what's going on here. And so I don't know. Likewise, I don't know what's happening in those images of the people that, you know, the selected images. It's not all the photographs of the people who slept with Marina Abramovich. Well, I'm sure that's a set too. But all of the people who sat with Marina Abramovich, I didn't show all of the photographs, and they're not photographs of all of the people that are available to me that sat with her. But when I went and looked at it, I'll just give the secret away. I just was like struck by a very gendered and raced response. I mean, in the hundreds of photographs, it's hard to find a woman who is not crying. And I can only sort of speculate about what they're crying about. And there are a few people that I read as men who are crying, and there's like a shit ton of men who are just like engaged in some kind of a weird staring contest. But mostly it's a museum, so it's mostly white people, but men of color in general are a few of the men that have having an emotional response, something that looks like an empathetic connection. There's a famous performance art scholar, Amelia Jones, who I've just been in dialogue as I'm writing this, and she's like, I hate that. I mean, she's written about Marina. I hate the spectacle of that. I don't think it's authentic. I don't think it's real. I haven't had a chance to read what Amelia thinks is happening in this piece.
Judith Rodenbeck asks, can you talk a little about the word indelible?
Well, I don't know, because I have a hard time spelling it. It's, when I was like writing on the script, it was often coming up as inedible, which is my next show, more of a musical. I was going to write inedible, but I choked. I don't know. Food for thought. I'm just, my students always call me the Punisher. It's my super. And once I start, it can't really be stopped. Indelible. That quote from Christine Blasey Ford when she was asked, I think by Dick Durbin, what her clearest memories of that time she was being assaulted were. And there were two things. There was one was the guys laughing at her. And the other thing was the fact that she thought Brett Kavanaugh might kill her. Accidentally. Was too drunk to know that his hand over her face might kill her. And that line or that moment in her testimony when she says, and it comes out in this beautiful sentence, indelible in the hippocampus, what is it? The campus. Hippos, campus. What is it? Whatever it is, performance artist, not speaking the language. Indelible in the hippocampus is the laughter. And Durbin sort of probes it. It's like about, there's a little bit of, he's kind of like softens the gender critique or the horror of what's happening there. And she's like, they're two friends, they're laughing with each other. There's a moment of male bonding, trying to rape her. And it's the idea that it's encoded in her body, that there's nothing that can get rid of that, is interesting to me. I mean, I don't know what to say other than yes, thank you. I don't know. Judith is also a super smart scholar of performance art, so she probably has something better to say.
Well, let's go to the next question, because I think what you're saying about indelible might come into this one as well. This is from Joan Lipkin. Hi, Joan. This was very moving, Holly, and unsettling in the most hopefully useful ways. You showed an image of Anita Hill. Can you possibly discuss her within the context of the work you are presenting?
Sure. Hi, Joan. Joan, another fellow thespian and activist and friend and girl about town, all the towns. The frame of this was too small to hold everything that I hoped it would hold. I think some of us will remember the sort of parallel testimony of Anita Hill testifying in 1991 in the confirmation hearings of Clarence Thomas. And, some of the parallels I remember is like how composed she was, how she worked so hard to tell the story and be present, but not let any of the emotions, whether it was the way she was being questioned or the memories, what they were bringing up in her, derail her. And also I remember that like how deranged Clarence Thomas was in contrast, like parallel to Brett Kavanaugh. Originally, I wanted to talk about like Brett Kavanaugh as theater, and he was a character from a melodrama. And I couldn't understand how they would call this testimony because there were no facts. It was like an absence of facts. It was a fact-free zone. But Anita Hill's bravery, courage, and talking about something that I think outside of feminist circles wasn't really theorized at that time, sexual harassment, was a huge moment. What did that moment mean? I'm not entirely sure. People are like so much, that was another thing that drove me crazy about the lead up to the Blasey Ford testimony, because they're like, seeing the parallels, but it's going to be so much different this time because we've learned so much. And I'm like, really? Like, what world do you live in? I want to go there, that we've learned so much. I think, they learned a couple of things. It looked really bad to have like a bunch of old guys rip this, very professional woman to shreds. That looked bad with Anita Hill. So they weren't going to do that. So they found like some woman to do that in a very sort of like, it was the duel of like, sort of white heteronormative femininities with Christine Blasey Ford and Rachel Martin, kind of like passive aggressive battle of mean girls, not mean girls. Christine Blasey Ford wasn't in that, but like Anita Hill's saga and utter character destruction. Those of us who are around will remember a little bit nutty, a little bit slutty. And a watershed moment, a person who did something heroic, but I don't know. Again, I sort of like call into question what was the culture's response? When somebody makes this kind of a testimony, it's not enough. The person listening, the people listening have to do something about it. And too much of the discourse is like, come forward, tell people. It's like, well, why? If nobody's going to do anything about it, why? It's not like it's a fun thing to tell someone about what happened to you in this way. I do have friends that argue that Christine Blasey Ford's testimony, though it didn't stop the confirmation of Brett Kavanaugh, was hugely important, partly catalyzed, being felt in the 2018 midterm elections. And a record number of women, some of them women of color, being elected across the country. So perhaps it was felt in that way.
And we have this from Brian Lobel. As performers or artists or makers or thespians, something you said about the reporter not watching the George Floyd video made me question, do you think there are moments that the show must not go on? Are there times that our art is best when it is not done?
I think you have to think about what are you what are you doing? What is it? I mean, I think that, you know, I hear a lot of people of color talking about this and decision, like, I'm not going to watch any more videos. I may not even look at these photographs. Yeah, they're maybe important in a criminal case, but I'm not going to do that to myself. I do think you need to think about what you're showing and what you're asking, and I don't think we need more catharsis. That's another thing that I would say. I'm going to adjust my lighting right now.
And Susan Fink writes, hi, Holly. Hi, Kim. Hi, Susan. Stunning connections. Holly, can you draw along these ways of thinking to Melanie T? Is she worth it?
I don't know who that is.
I'm afraid I don't either. Maybe Susan, you could type in a little more about Melanie T. I'm sorry, we don't know the reference. And while you're doing that, we have a question from Anita Young. Hi, Anita, my colleague in Art and Art History. And she writes, isn't the Abramovich art piece similar to the Milgram's experiment on obedience to authority carried out at Yale? Where are the lines between art and science and life?
Well, that last question is really easy to answer, I think, and is that there's a strand in 20th century and into the new century art of like wanting to erase that line, not being so interested, you know. And I tried to get at the beginning, like this idea that you can designate anything as a piece of art. I mean, thinking about Duchamp and his urinal as a fountain. It's something that runs through modernism and into postmodernism is where is the line. I mean, what's different about I think there's a big difference between this and the Milgram experiment is there's no trick. Like, there's no trick. People could have not done anything. I mean, I suppose they could have not done something in the Milgram thing, but like, they could have not used any of those items that were sharp objects or, could have caused her pain or hurt her. They could have made that choice. Mm-hmm. I mean, I'll say again, I think this is an important piece to talk about, but like the idea that this piece is made disturbs me because I think I live in a feminist world, where I already know what this piece reveals. And the fact that people find this piece interesting, to me says, oh, we don't share the same understanding. I don't know what people are seeing in this piece. Like, like, where's the fucking critique? Oh, it's all about the male gaze. It's like, yeah, we knew that. Like,
well, we have a follow-up from Jennifer Metzger, who is asking, who are the performance artists today? Do they go beyond the performers?
They go beyond the performers. Well, there's a lot of different, on one level right now, I'll just say, all performing arts are kind of on hiatus. I mean, I know that there's people, I mean, Brian Lobello asked a question earlier, is coming in from London, and he's a U of M grad, and now he's a professor at in London, and has an international career as a performance artist. And I think he's thinking about using the virtual space to make performance work. But I think there's like a big question about when we're on the other side of the pandemic, what does performance look like? And what is, and particularly the kinds of performance work that I'm talking about here, which I don't know if that work is made as much anymore. Although Bill Popel is still doing similar kinds of work, this kind of endurance work. How does this work sit in a conversation where you have video of a police officer putting his knee on the neck of a man for almost 10 minutes while people watch? Suddenly endurance and putting yourself in harm maybe is like a less interesting idea. It was never that interesting to me to investigate. But it becomes maybe less interesting question to ask around the aesthetics of that. But I also think performance is used in protest a lot. People are, I would hear, I did not go physically to any of the protests last summer because of the epidemic. But friends of mine who went talked about, people taking, kneeling often for 8.5 minutes. Now it's almost 10 minutes that he was kneeling, and how difficult that was. It's physically difficult to hold that position. I mean, even for somebody who, that there's a real commitment there in Chauvin to hold that position. So I think there's integration of performance into various protest movements.
And a question from our friend Ellen Lewin. Hi, Ellen.
Hey,
Anthropology. She asks, is the intersection of the Blasey Ford testimony with recent current political behavior the thing that makes it different from Marina Abramovich?
Can you read that again?
Is the intersection of the Blasey Ford testimony with recent current political behavior the thing that makes it different from Marina Abramovich?
No, I think it's Marina Abramovich's investment in that piece, in showing that she can endure male violence, inviting it, enduring it, and being sort of venerated and applauded for it. It's kind of an art martyr, which to my mind normalizes it. It aestheticizes it. And I think cut piece is a more complicated piece, but I think I'm not interested in pieces where women are facing off with danger and pledging to be passive, because like we've had millennia of that. I'm like, let's find something new. Let's do something else. Let's not just show how much women or other minoritized people can take, right? And then applause. And I think that, I don't know how Christine Blasey Ford understands herself as a feminist or not as a feminist. Although looking at her scholarly output, I have to imagine that she's not anti-feminist, but Marina Abramovich pretty actively is. And I think how you locate what you're doing makes a difference.
Mhm. And Carol Fuller makes a comment with a question, and I think you touched on this earlier, but maybe you could say a little more. She writes, I found the photos of male and female to be profoundly different in the Marina Abramovich piece. Did you?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Really different. Like I said, it was hard. It wasn't that all of the people that I understood as men were doing stony-eyed stare downs of her. But that was the majority. That was the overwhelming majority, especially of the white guys. And some of the people and some of the men of color as well. More of the men of color had some sort of emotional experience. It was hard to find women. There's a few women that are like really like, it's a stare down. I don't know what's going on. Like, who's going to blink first? I mean, there's hostility. There's a few of that. But it's in fact, on Facebook, where I live most of my life, and there's people like, I'm getting off Facebook, and it's like, I'm getting off the rest of life and just living on Facebook, especially now that it's like, that there's other cooler, hipper things, and it's just us geezers. I'm very happy there, and I'd be happy to like just be a person that lived on Facebook. So that's my little confession. I posted without commenting on my Facebook page, like here's a compare and contrast of some of these. And it was very interesting how quickly I felt how troubling I felt like the response was really quickly. I think people saw what I saw, is that there were a lot of white men staring at Marina with hostility. And they were like, but other people are watching, which, it was public, people are watching, or I felt like there were a lot of excuses being made. And then people were like, I don't get it. Why is this so moving? And I don't know, I'm, a bunch of individuals. So my speculation is it was just being seen. And my speculation would be that sitting there and looking at her, you recognize how difficult it is what she's doing. It doesn't really feel passive. I mean, it's actually quite unlike the thing where you have the table full of sharp objects. It takes effort to stay still, like to look, to return the gaze. And she's a big, imposing, charismatic woman. And I think that and she's taking up space. She took up a lot of space. She did this retrospective and she took over the whole atrium. And I just the thing that this woman was taking up space in that way and doing something so simple. I'm imagining that other women might be recognizing something, I don't know if it's heroic or ballsy. You just use that word, very problematic, but I'm a problematic person. Daring, that they responded to. I guess, I don't know. Yeah, they were very weird and very clear.
We have a clarification now from Susan Fink, who was she was remarking on the connections you were making in the presentation. So she's saying, Holly, can you draw along these ways of thinking to Melania T? Is she worth it?
Is she worth thinking about? I mean, Melania is another woman. Here's the thing. Women are not innocent. Women are complicit in patriarchy and in a way that in fact nothing wins a woman more points than bashing another woman and trashing other women. So there have been women like Melania who have learned how to sort of like game the system. So, I mean, I remember when Trump was first elected, there was a lot of, and there wasn't a lot of warmth between the two of them, and people were reading into that. And she was pretty clearly saying, don't feel bad for me. And, and in case you didn't get that moment of her going off to the detention camps and she's wearing a jacket that says, I don't care, do you? It's like, okay, that's clear. I'm sometimes a little slow, but I think I'm hearing you, lady. I hear what you're saying here. And okay, I won't care about you. And, goodbye. So.
Okay. Well, we have a couple of questions about this medium that you were presenting this piece in. And one is from Megan Gogarty, my colleague in. Good evening, Megan. And she writes, this piece is so inspiring and challenging. Thank you so much.
Oh, wow.
You envision it performed in real life and not on Zoom. Do you imagine yourself in a lecture hall?
I imagine it taking another form than what it took tonight. And I'll also say that I would clearly and happily invite anyone who wanted to discuss this piece with me and talk about what they saw. I'm the only Holly Hughes at the University of Michigan, Hughes at umich.edu. I would love to have a fuller discussion of it. I think that the images and the media are an important part of it, and I would also there's a lot of questions that I have, like what role what parts stay in, what parts don't stay in. But I think having it live, but including the images feel important. It feels important to put stuff in, context, which is sometimes hard it's like certainly in the context of like Anita Hill, in these other contexts. But it's a limited canvas too. How to acknowledge and summon that this fits into a larger conversation, and yet have some sort of focus and specificity. I don't know. I'm still figuring out what it is a little bit too, what I'm saying.
Yeah.
I think that is, and in that I'm indebted to my friend Cindy Carr. I don't know if Cindy Carr is listening tonight, but Cindy is an amazing writer. Her most recent book was a biography of David Wojnarowicz, and she's working on a biography of Candy Darling. And she's also somebody who wrote extensively about performance and other weird art forms. And she's a feminist and she's queer and she's a dear friend. And I dumped my, sort of random tidbits on her head along with a few other people. And she kind of helped me sort through it. I don't know how to make sense of my work except in conversation. So there's that part of it too. I wish I were somebody who could just go to the artist retreat and, you know, I don't know, churn something out, and then it would live in some other kind of form. But I'm always interested. I mean, one of the reasons why I stayed in performance and theater and why it was much more interesting to me than visual art is like, you got to be with other people at some point in theater or performance or whatever the hell you want to call it. Thespianic adventures, right? You know, you're in the room with other people and figuring it out together.
And that goes right to this next question. This person writes, I've always loved being an audience member at one of your shows. I laugh and clap and gasp out loud, but this time you couldn't hear me. As you're performing, how do you compensate for no visible or audible audience? Fondly, a fan, a really big fan.
Oh, I wonder if I know who this is. Well, you know, I'm a ham and a curmudgeon and a know-it-all. So, you know, and I mean, a know-it-all, like the person who like, you know, has an idea and just you know, a half-baked idea and just runs with it. So, you know, of course I do wonder, like, you know, I have no idea like how this landed, you know, no idea, like, did most people leave, what they thought. So that is weird. Like that I can't see people's faces or see any reaction. I mean, like, I have no idea how this landed for people. That people are asking questions, and some people that I like a lot means that for some of you, it was worth talking about. But, you know, that now I'm thinking about it, it's like, I don't know. I mean, I don't know how it landed and what to make of that. There was some protection in that because this feels like a scary piece in a lot of different ways to me. Like, I'm sort of like adjacent to some kind of scholarship here, but I'm not a scholar. You know, that felt like a risky piece in different ways, always when it's new.
Well, it was, and just so you know, half the audience is still here. So we had about 120 people, and 61 people are still here, almost an hour into the Q&A. So I think that tells you a lot. And we have this from John Weir, who writes, that was a fantastic and profound presentation. Thanks. You mentioned the fetishizing of the trauma, of the traumatizing act, even of the traumatized person, which indeed, is it possible to tell your trauma narrative without reenacting the trauma, without re-traumatizing the teller, re-traumatizing the audience? How do you make art about trauma that enacts change rather than just reenacting trauma? I'm not saying I can answer that question. Oh my God.
I thought he was going to say that. So John Weir there's so many, like, I can't believe the people that are in this room, like some people from your university, from different, you know, like some artists and thinkers that I really admire. And John Weir is one of my favorite. I feel like I have this intense friendship with him that's mostly, you know, is disembodied and happens on Facebook. You know, but I understand that he does have a body and a person, and I've seen it. And he's a wonderful, wonderful writer, and he has a new collection of of stories that are coming out. I think next year, Red Hen Press, he just won an award. And John Weir is a gay man who wrote some of the most intense stuff about living through the AIDS epidemic, the irreversible decline of Eddie Socket, and What I Did Wrong, I think is another name. And he also, in this new collection of he calls them stories. I mean, it seems sort of to think about like Gail Griffin, like sort of, I read them as like sort of creative nonfiction essays, and it's kind of a memoir. It's a lot about those early experiences of homophobia and gender oppression, and how it doesn't get better. I mean, you're not in middle school and being beaten up anymore, but the damage of that in beautiful prose that's also very funny. I don't know. I mean, that is a question. Why am I so eager to tell these stories? I mean, there is something, maybe it is that there is a hearkening back to my consciousness raising days. I remember the like kind of charge of sitting around in the circle and people telling their story, and some, everyone had stuff that had happened to them that was just wrenching. Even people who like lives had been very comfortable and happy, happy, whatever that is. There was this moment of connection and catharsis, and this call to do something about it. That it wasn't just a bad thing that happened to you personally. It probably happened to other people. And through that terrible thing that happened to you, we were like a way to talk about larger things. I mean, how many times in the world do I say structures and systems? I'm just very small. At least I wasn't saying fuck. My other most frequently used, or dog, my most frequently used vocabulary. I don't know. Those are questions. What use do you make of trauma, and is it okay to make use of it? I think there's something important about it. I think that, otherwise we wouldn't, every Holocaust Remembrance Day, there's kind of like a sense of like, oh, we're losing people. And it's important to tell these stories and not just have it be like these terrible things happen, here's the facts. But this is what it looked like to real people. But there is also the thing of like how many terrible stories backed up by documentary evidence of horrible things happening to Black people and also to other people of color. How many more do we need to know to do something about it? And what does that something mean? And that something has to be arrived at collectively. And what is the frame? Where's the place that collective action happens? So I think just like telling bad stories, it's easy to freak people out. I don't know.
Sort of related to that, but Gail Griffin coming back with another comment here and reflecting on the Abramovich, and she writes, I'm thinking about how girls are taught implicitly not to meet the male gaze, which is free to scrutinize us all day long. So
Right.
when the woman stares back, the white man is really, really challenged. The man of color has had a different experience of gaze, his own and white men's and women's. Traditionally in Western literature and art, the girl-woman's eyes are cast down. That equals modesty. Looking back at the guy, brazen.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, I think just sitting there and taking up that much space in fucking MoMA, one of the capitals of art, looking, but also just saying it can be this simple. It can be this simple. And I can be that, as opposed to like all the conversations I have with my talented female artists, students who like hardly ever think that their work is any good. And, and not all of the men think that their work is very good, but it's not uncommon to have more of the white men think that their work is good. And then it enables them to work on their work more, like to become better, because they're like, yeah, this is good. This is important. I am important. I have things to say. And sometimes it's like, screw you, you old dyke. What do you have to say? And then sometimes it's like, no, I can hear how it could be better, because I feel okay about myself. I'm just like, wow, that's a thing. That sounds good. I don't want to take that away from anybody, but like, can we give it to other people? I think like Gail, I mean, this is like, you see the brilliance of Gail Rubin and Why You Must Get Her Books, because she just like summarized it. Yeah, that's what's happening. Maybe I can get Gail to write this. Be very interesting.
Here's a comment from Paula Grant. In defining Christine Blasey Ford's testimony as performance, do you think she had an idea of how very long the performance would continue for her anyway after the event? For the feminist audience, it isn't over either. Intentional performance, such as Marina's, has an ending.
Right. No, I think I haven't read the book that's about the Brett Kavanaugh hearing, but I have read She Said by Megan Twohey and Jodi Kantor, which is mostly about Harvey Weinstein, but the last chapter is about Christine Blasey Ford. And she really did not want to come forward. I mean, she was very ambivalent, and she kind of got a little, neither did Anita Hill. She wanted something to be done. They both told people, and they wanted somebody with some authority and power to do something, but they didn't want to have to be the ones that did the doing. And I think they both knew it wasn't going to go well for them. And I think Christine Blasey Ford very much knew it would take a toll. Both her work is about studying trauma. So yeah, I think she knew. The worst part about the Christine, the like sort of worst thing about all of this to me, or one of the worst things, because it echoes my mother's betrayal. So of course that's the thing I glom onto, is that her husband's family, their extended family, really circled the wagons around Christine Blasey Ford and her husband, and were very supportive and, made public statements about it, but not Christine Blasey Ford's family. Her father belongs to the same country club as Brett Kavanaugh's parents. So the idea that he said that he didn't know her is ridiculous. They traveled in the same social circles from very early on. Her father, Christine Blasey Ford, apologized to Brett Kavanaugh's parents for what his daughter did. I mean, I think that the choices, and I also see as somebody who put a lot of distance between herself and her family of origin early on, I'm sure her family didn't know about this, but I think she also thought, I can't tell them. And she made choices early on in her life to put a continent between, it's not like she was totally estranged, a continent between to uproot herself from the DC area and make her life in the West Coast. And I think that was a lot about the way she could live with what happened to her and how much proximity to her family could she bear. She knew who they were.
Well, our time is winding down here, Holly. So I'd just like to read to you some of the remaining comments, and half of your audience is still with us. So thank you all so much for remaining. So here's this from Carson Kreitzer. Hi, Holly. Not a question, just inspired to write in by your question about who is here still watching. Well, Carson Kreitzer here, watching from Minneapolis. Thank you for this. And I loved watching it unfold on Facebook first and then seeing the full talk. Thank you especially for permission to not like cut piece and the similar Abramovich piece. As a non-performance artist, I felt that I just wasn't getting what was important and not just dangerous and horrifying. I love this context for the Blasey Ford testimony, and so much. Thank you for inviting us to join.
Oh, Carson, thank you so much for, and everybody who came. Again, I would love to hear, if people had more things to say, I would be incredibly grateful to continue those conversations. Carson is a really brilliant playwright in Minneapolis, and girl, it's not, it's like messed up, that shit, cutting stuff off me. It's, yeah, go ahead.
Okay, well, Stephen Rains writes, such a valuable performance and conversation. Thank you. Betsy Sheevy, so brilliant. And Anita Young pipes back in, we need the clapping hands emoji.
Right.
I think that takes us through, Sharon Thompson. So much to think about. Almost too much, just so rich and so troubling. Thank you so much. And here's a ridiculous idea. You do another generation of the piece as Jane Fonda, back and forth as you and Jane Fonda.
Okay, so to do that, I definitely need, I hope John Weir is still here because he's my go-to person on Jane Fonda. I think I like, collaboration with Sharon Thompson, who's also a very extremely smart feminist scholar. John Weir, fine. Sounds good.
Okay. Tanya Augsburg, many thanks, Holly. So fantastic. Lee Dygard, love you and your brilliance forever, Holly. This is Lee D. I'll write you later. Becky Bowen. Nancy Manahan and Becky Bowen still here in Florida, listening, appreciating, applauding your brilliant, thoughtful insights. And John Weir has written, oh my God, we love Jane. Okay, folks, you've all been so wonderful and supportive tonight, hanging in there for this entire webinar. Our deep thanks to Holly for bringing this piece to us and hanging in there for this rich Q&A.
It was the best Q&A. I mean, maybe some parts of our lives should always be virtual. It was the best Q&A. And I also loved being able to recognize all of the people that I knew from other parts of my life. And it's so incredibly meaningful that you were here and engaged with us. But it was a so wonderful opportunity, Kim. Thank you for making it possible.
Well, thank you. And we're all just trying to compensate for the fact that we can't be in the same room and we can't applaud and come up and, and talk to you afterward.
And go out. Like we should be going out. Like that's the postmortem.
All right. Well, we'll all go have a drink now in your honor, Holly.
All right.
All right. Have a good night, everyone. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.